Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about the next element of design, and that's the illusion of space. Of course, we're talking about two dimensions here, so we're talking about a flat surface, a flat picture plane. The picture plane is the frontal plane of the painting or drawing or photograph, collage, etc. And sometimes artists decide that they are not interested in creating an illusion of space in that picture plane. As you can see on the example here on the left, we have various colors and shapes, but we don't have much of an illusion of depth in the picture plane. As opposed to the photograph on the right, which is a photograph, obviously, of an architectural space where we feel like the picture plane becomes a window into which we have that illusion of depth, as if we could walk into that space and walk farther away from that starting point. One of the vocabulary words or things we want to keep in mind when talking about the illusion of space is the idea of the horizon line. The horizon line is going to represent the farthest point that we can see. And here we see it as the delineation between the water and the sky, the ocean and the sky, which most of us should be familiar with living in Southern California, sitting on the sand, looking out over the ocean, and seeing where the ocean meets the sky. That is the farthest point that we can see. So as objects get closer to a horizon line, they're getting farther away from the viewer. And when we talk about linear perspective later, this horizon line is going to be very important. When talking about the illusion of space, it helps to use the terms foreground, middle ground, and background. The foreground is the part of the picture that is closest to the viewer. So in this case, we could think about the bear and the boat as being in the foreground. The background is going to be the farthest away. So back here we have some distant mountains and hills in the very background. And then the middle ground is going to be this area in between the foreground and the background. So when trying to create a deep illusion of space where you really want that window to feel like it's going back a great distance, establishing a clear foreground, middle ground, and background is going to be important. Okay, so how does the artist create an illusion of space in a two-dimensional surface? So here we have a painting where we can see an obvious foreground with the figures in the front, middle ground with several figures kind of in between, and then the background, the buildings and the people that are farthest away from us. How does the artist separate foreground, middle ground, and background? Well, the answer is there are many ways that the artist does this, and thoughtful and very thoughtful consideration of all of these techniques is going to lead to the most interesting visual composition and the most illusion of space. So the first thing you might notice is scale or size, right? So if you have objects that are similarly sized, like people, the closer they are to you, the larger they're going to be. As they get farther away, they're going to appear smaller. And this is something that we all figured out as children, that we could draw people getting smaller, or trees getting smaller, or houses getting smaller, and that would give us the illusion that they were farther away. The thing that I notice most beginning artists and students seem to miss, however, is how quickly that shift can happen. So I'd like you to take a minute here just to look at the figures in the foreground and think about how tall, right, these figures in the foreground are. They take up about 3/4 or a little over half of the picture plane, of the height of the picture plane, right? Of the height of the composition. However, this figure right here, who is not that far behind the figures in the foreground, he only looks like he's a few steps away, only takes up about 1/3 of the picture plane, right? And these figures here that took up so much of the picture plane, we're not even seeing their whole body. They're getting cut off around the knees here. So significant difference in scale between the foreground figures and the middle ground figures. If you look at these figures, just slightly behind, again, great reduction in size, about half the size of this figure. And then the ones in the background are just teeny in comparison. So although most artists or non-artists will reduce the size of similarly shaped objects as they recede into the background, usually the reduction in size is not as dramatic as it should be for full effect. The one thing, okay, moving on. So the next thing to think about is overlap. So again, we all know that if one thing is in front of another thing, it's going to cover the thing that's behind it. Again, using this, however, to really help you create the best composition that you can, more interesting composition, more dynamic composition, and again, increase that illusion of space. So you'll notice here, the artist has a third figure in the foreground who's not part of the focal point. But this figure is just slightly in front of these other two figures. And one of the main ways we know that, we see it a little bit with scale, but we also see it with his umbrella. So his umbrella just barely overlaps the umbrella of these two figures next to him, and that starts to create this really interesting negative space in here, negative shapes, and it increases that illusion, that feeling of depth. So again, another thing that I notice artists, photographers, student artists, when setting up a landscape, setting up a composition, setting up a photograph, pay attention to your point of view, pay attention to how you arrange your objects, and think about if you can have objects, whether they're objects that are in the foreground, the middle ground, the background, how can you use overlap to create a more interesting composition? The next way the artist creates that illusion of space is through something we call vertical location. So vertical location is the idea that as things are farther away, they're higher up vertically in the picture plane. So we see that with the feet of the figures, right? So we actually already kind of marked the feet of the figures here. And you'll notice the feet of the figures, the feet of these figures is, way down here somewhere. The farther away they are, the vertical location of those objects changes. It is higher on the picture plane. Notice, however, that the eyesight, the eye line of these figures is more or less the same throughout. So, and that actually has to do with linear perspective. As we later when we talk about linear perspective, we'll see why their eye line is about the same, but the vertical location of their feet is different. So to review the first few ways that we saw this creation of depth, size, overlap, and vertical location. In a moment, we'll talk about atmospheric perspective, which talks about value and value contrast, color, saturation, and color contrast, definition, and linear perspective as well. Just another image here that shows size. Obviously, size is going to work best if you have repetition of objects that we know are similarly sized, like people or trees or houses. Exaggerated size can be a really useful tool in design to create a really dynamic composition, and you'll see it a lot here. You can see it, in movie posters and other kind of graphic design uses, where the foreground figure or the foreground object is very large, often cropped on three sides of the picture plane, top, left, and bottom, or right and bottom. And then the rest of the imagery is significantly smaller in the background. This change in size works with abstract shapes as well. So if you have any kind of repetition of shape, even if it's an abstract shape, a non-representational shape like these squares here, our brain will start thinking about those squares as being farther away. We'll think of this as them being similar objects, some of them being in the foreground and some of them being in the background. However, this is not as effective if you start having a variety of shapes, as our eye then just sees that as variety and not necessarily that some things are closer and some things are farther away. Overlap, again, is going to be most effective if paired with a shift in size. And the idea here is to remember to actually use it. So we all know that it's there for us, but actually remembering to use it when creating our compositions, thinking about them consciously and thinking about how you can really thoughtfully arrange the various objects in your composition to create more interesting negative shapes and to increase that illusion of depth. Overlap can also be really helpful when you're thinking about groupings of objects or groupings of people. In this painting here, we have what we would call a shallow depth of field, where it doesn't feel like we can go very deep into this painting. It only feels like there's a couple feet of space there, so we have a very claustrophobic, tight feeling with all of these figures, and so all the overlap of the figures really adds to that feeling. It adds to the drama, and it adds to that feeling of that claustrophobic space. And we see that a lot with still life, of course, where things are very clustered together. And here we see it in animation as well. Vertical location. So vertical location, of course, is often paired with scale and overlap, but not always. And what you'll notice is that in some traditional Middle Eastern and Asian art, vertical location is often used on its own to create that illusion of space. So even without shifts in scale or without much overlap, we can still understand that objects like these vessels or this figure are in the foreground, this layer of figures is farther away, and that this layer of figures here is the farthest away, even though the scale of them isn't shifting and they really aren't overlapping each other that much, a little bit on the side here. We still know that they are farther away from us because of their vertical location. And that's really based on the way we see things in real life. So in real life, if everyone right now, if you look down at your feet, take a minute, look down at your toes, the first things that you're going to see as you're looking down at your toes are the things that are closest to you. And as you slowly move your head up, you're going to see things that are farther and farther away from you. So that idea that as your eyes go from low to high, you see things that are farther away is mimicked on the picture plane. And here's just a couple more examples from the very traditional on the left to pop art on the right. And this phenomenon is going to be reversed if you're ever doing a bird's eye image or something up above looking down. Then, instead of having the things closest to you being on the bottom of the picture plane, they're going to be on the top, and then the ground, which is farthest from you, will actually be at the bottom of the picture plane. Okay, so next we're going to move on to atmospheric or aerial perspective. An atmospheric or aerial perspective has three main points to it: value, color, and definition. All three of those things shift when it comes to atmospheric perspective. So value shifts. If you look at the image on the right here, you have in the foreground, you have a high contrast of values. You have very light values in the reflections on the water. You have very dark values in the shadows. But as we get farther away, like these distant mountains back here, right, you'll notice that the values are very light and there's very low contrast of value. So, never mind. So there's very low contrast of value there. So you don't have the high contrast that you have in the foreground. Color. Color shifts in the background as well. So again, in the foreground, you have high contrast of color. You have blues, you have the warm reddish browns, you have, the blues, the greens, the browns, all the different colors can exist in the foreground. But as we get into the background again, the colors in general become more of a blue-gray color. And remember, the graying of color is called desaturation. So color becomes desaturated and we have less contrast of color. We don't have that whole range of the color wheel that we had in the foreground. Lastly, definition. So remember, definition is a term that we learned when we talked about the element shape. And definition is how defined edges are. So what this means is that in the foreground we can see texture, right? We can see like the little textures of grasses or textures of leaves, the ripples on the water, etc. We can see contour lines. We can see all those little details. But as we get into the distance, those contour lines are a lot fuzzier, right? So even the edge of the mountain here is kind of more of a blurred line. And we lose all of the details that we can see in the foreground. Here you can see that shift in value just looking at a black and white photo, an Ansel Adams photo of Yosemite here. A lot of students tend to think that things are going to get darker as they go into the background, so it's important to remember that they actually do get lighter as they go into the background, not darker. Again, seeing that value shift as it gets towards the horizon line. And what I want to point out here is that at the horizon line, when we shift into the sky, it goes in reverse, right? So remember, the horizon line is farthest away, so the sky closest to the horizon line is actually lighter than the sky farther from the horizon line, because your values are going to get lighter as you go towards the horizon line. And color, just looking at one more example of color here. Colors becoming more neutral. Here we have kind of a sunset, which throws off that feeling of the blue grays, because now of course we have more of a warm color palette. But we definitely can still see that the colors are becoming more desaturated. In the background we have less contrast of color, we have less contrast of value, and we definitely have the decreased definition as well. So moving on to definition, again, these cars in the distance aren't that far away, right? They're just down the block. It's not like they're miles away. But look at the difference in definition, this car that's right here in the foreground versus the one that's only, a quarter of a block away. We see a lot less contour lines, a lot less detail, with the short amount of space. So really paying attention to how quickly these shifts can happen in the picture plane. Of course, in photography, cinematography, we can use settings on cameras to really emphasize these shifts in definition, and that can lead to a really interesting photo or really interesting film scene, and also help with that illusion of depth, also help create the focal point as well. You could also have atmospheric perspective indoors as well. Obviously, it's not going to be quite as exaggerated as looking outside, but artists and photographers will often use all of these ideas of decreased value contrast, decreased color contrast, and definitely a decreased definition, just to show foreground, background in an interior space as well as an exterior space. So linear perspective is something that we're actually going to talk about in depth later. So I'm just going to give you a very, very quick overview of linear perspective to begin with. Linear perspective is all based on the idea of parallel lines. So remember, parallel lines are lines like a railroad track. They're two lines that never meet. They're equal distance apart, just like a railroad track. Those two rails of the railroad track always are going to be equal distance apart. However, to the eye, when looking at those lines in space, they appear to meet. So if we look at a railroad track, those lines appear to come together, even though we know that they don't actually come together. They don't converge. And what we notice in linear perspective is that parallel lines, so here, for example, the lines of the stairs, the lines in the tiles, the line where the ceiling meets the wall, all of those lines are parallel. they all appear to converge at one spot, and that spot happens to be on the horizon line, which brings us back to the beginning. So all of these lines converge at one spot on the horizon line, and that spot is called the vanishing point. And make sure you remember that the vanishing point is in fact different than the focal point, totally different concept here. And we'll learn about in linear perspective when you would have more than one vanishing point as well. Okay, so just to recap here, how does the artist create the illusion of space? Take a minute to look at this illustration. If you have a pen and pencil, you can jot down your thoughts. What are all of the ways the artist has created an illusion of space in this illustration? So you should have noticed the artist used shifts in scale. We have the lily pads here going from big to small as they get farther away. The artist has used quite a lot of overlap, of course, again, with the lily pads here. The artist has used vertical location, so the bottom edge of these lily pads, right? The farther away they are, the higher they are in the picture plane. The artist has used atmospheric perspective, which includes three main points: value, color, and definition. Value gets lighter. We can't see the horizon line here, but we can imagine more or less where it would be. So values are lighter as they get towards the horizon line, and there's less contrast of value. So again, remember, in the foreground, you can have light values, you can have dark values, you can have middle values. We have the lights of the highlights, we have the darks of the shadows. We have high value contrast. In the background, we have low value contrast with overall lighter values. Color. Again, in the foreground, you can have high range contrast of color. We have reds, we have greens. Those are opposites on the color wheel, so we have high contrast of color. In the background, we have very low contrast of color, and the color has become desaturated. And definition. In the foreground, we see texture, we see details, we see contour lines. In the background, and very quickly in the background here, in the middle ground, you can see from the foreground lily pads to the middle ground lily pads, we really lose all of that definition. So you no longer see the contour lines, you no longer have the crisp edges. Everything is kind of blurring together. And that wraps up creating the illusion of space. To be continued with linear perspective coming soon.